There we go. I think we're ready to start whenever you guys are.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Joanna, and thank you for everybody who's joined us this afternoon. I'm Maggie Butt, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this hour of Poems for the Planet with my fellow poets and my good friends from North London, Sarah Doyle, Julian Bishop, and Cheryl Moskowitz. We're all members of the Poets for the Planet organisation. We're writers who share a great concern about the climate emergency. A year ago, we decided to put together a pamphlet with a selection of our ecological poems, which looks like this, to be sold in aid of eco-charities. Unfortunately, we only managed 2 readings from it before we had to go into lockdown. So now it's a huge pleasure to have this opportunity to share our work with the stay-at-home audience. We are each going to read a few of our own poems and one of somebody else's, which we very much admire. And I hope that you're going to really enjoy the next hour.
Thank you. Thank you. And now it's my very great pleasure to introduce Maggie as our first reader. Maggie Butt is an ex-journalist and TV producer, and thankfully for us, she's now turned poet and novelist. Her 6th poetry collection, Everlove, was published last month by London Magazine Editions, and I meant to have it here to wave around, but I've obviously been carrying it around in my bag and everywhere else under my bed, and I can't find it at the minute. Her novel Prisoner's Wife, there it is. Her novel Prisoner's Wife was published by Penguin Random House imprints across the world last year under her maiden name, Maggie Brooks. As well as her 5 previous poetry collections, her poems appear widely in international magazines and anthologies, a mobile phone app, choreography, and festivals. She taught creative writing at Middlesex University for 30 years and has judged a number of international poetry competitions and was longlisted herself in the National. She raised money for refugees in London a few years ago by organising a very successful poemathon, and her latest poetry collection, as I've said, Everlove, includes a sequence about the refugee crisis as well as poems about ecological issues. And I just want to add in these last few seconds that I have that despite Maggie's extraordinarily prolific output, she's also one of the kindest and most generous and proactive people I know. She really makes things happen, and if it wasn't for Maggie, this wouldn't be happening, and neither would our pamphlet, Poems for the Planet. So thank you. Over to you, Maggie.
Thank you, Cheryl. I wish I believed all these things that I hear about myself, but I take it from Cheryl to say that it must be true. Okay, I'm going to begin with a poem that I first read on the Underground. It was a poem by Cicely Herbert called Everything Changes, and I wish I'd written it. Everything changes. We plant trees for those born later, but what's happened has happened, and poisons poured into the seas cannot be drained out again. What's happened has happened. Poisons poured into the seas cannot be drained out again. But everything changes. We plant trees for those born later. I'm going to continue with the message of hope to begin with by telling you a true story about a Himalayan rainforest that was prevented from being cut down in 1978. Chipko, 1978. They set off singing and with drums, close together in the pre-dawn grey. Summon courage on the winding path. Their feet talk to the dry, cracked earth where other trees once stood. Dust blows determination in their eyes and mouths. She lays her cheek against the knobbly bark, wraps arms around its years of growth, listens to sap rising, leaf speak, green, tries not to see Amrita Devi axed down with her arms about a tree, her small heart set against the strength of money. The loggers are felled to silence at the sight. Bright saris flower against each dark trunk. The forest, a garden of women. So we can make change and we can make things happen. And let's hope we can get ourselves out of this terrible mess that we've got ourselves into. The next poem is really me thinking about how the hell did we get ourselves into this mess. And I used to be a documentary maker. So it's in the form of a documentary taking us from the past to the future. A history of stuff. Flashback. 2 China dogs from Woolworths, one with a chipped ear, stand guard upon the mantelpiece, keep watch over 6 books, a crystal radio. Upstairs, 2 workday dresses and 1 Sunday best. Back door ajar for neighbours to drop in. Cutaway, hairbrush and powder puff on dressing table. Dissolve to the door of the shopping mall bursts open on the first day of the sale. Hordes crush in, trampling each other in their urgency. They struggle to the car with bulging bags. Cutaway, lights on standby, blink and wink all night. Fast forward. Part of the cliff falls away to reveal the stratum of compressed plastic which choked the seas. Its come and by colours undimmed by time, last vestiges of an extinct species which couldn't get enough stuff. I'm going to stay in this dystopian vein for the next poem, where we might find ourselves unless we can find a way out. After the bees. Gold is falling on the honey standard. Truckloads of bullion are shipped from Fort Knox and replaced by fleece-wrapped jars of liquid amber. The fabled scents of clover, lavender, jasmine, lost flowers of the past, unreal as unicorns and dragons, extinct as butterflies. The price of vintage cotton t-shirts soars, rarer now than diamonds. Old people tell tales of crisply laundered cotton sheets sailing on washing lines, the mythical coolness of linen, the smell of a fresh pillowcase. Rumours fly of the super rich with secret high-walled fields of crops pollinated by hand, tomatoes, peaches, mulberry leaves for silkworms, kept alive by squirrel brushes, slaves and endless patience. But even they cannot make honey. We all know that disruptions to weather are one of the signs of the climate crisis we are facing. And this is about a hurricane, which you may remember from 2017. Ophelia flames a warning over the skies of Europe that her kind will come again to beat their great bat wings, to tear trees from their roots, lift calves, roofs, houses, tossing them aside, their owners running hitherly, thitherly like disturbed rats in a nest. That beneath more storms' clawed feet, the writhing seas, hellhounds grown huge with meltwater's grief, will gnaw the beaches, hurl themselves at sea walls, break through to gorge on the land, guzzle, chew and spew. Rising from her cave in the Azores, windward she wings the ocean, drench lashes lonely boats with a downpour of anguish, while her furious breath fans forest fires in Spain and Portugal, blowing their earth-burn stench to Devonshire, whipping up their ash with one flick of her scaly tail to paint a last day's omen sky of gleaming gold, spun copper, a blood orange sun over London, while the golden dust of the Sahara falls with the silence of snow on English cities. I've mentioned in that poem the melting ice caps and glaciers, and I know that that's something which concerns all of us. And this poem is in the voice of the meltwater itself. Meltwater, my time is coming. Smell it on the wind. Watch raindrops winnowing down glass. Touch ice cube to your lips and tongue. Feel the cool chemistry of meltwater. See me submerge fields and swallow crops, spill out of wells to infiltrate your graves, raising the dead. Firm ground will swamp to ooze and squelch and slip. mud symphony. Hear gurgles, trickles, runnels in your sleep. Reach for the drifting flotsam of your dreams. Sweep river sludge and sewage from the rug. Swell my boundaries with your salt tears. Heave seas, wide breaths to rear up hills. Waves come to claim their lost inheritance. Listen to the future. Rain-rocked, lake-like. Nothing divides the waters from the waters. As Cheryl said, my new book, Everlove, has a sequence about refugees. And I'm very concerned about the effect of climate crisis on people. So the next poem, Flood, is in Everlove. And I should tell you, there are currently more than 70 million displaced people in the world, of whom about 25 million are refugees. And that number can only increase as people are forced to migrate either by floodwaters rising or because their homes become too dry to live in and they can't grow crops anymore. Julian is going to help me reading this poem, because it seems to me that the floods we face are, as the cliche says, of biblical proportions. And Julian is going to help me by reading quotes from the Bible about biblical floods. Flood.
Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war.
In great haste, the people gather up their bundles.
And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it.
The people gather their children to their breast.
All the fountains of the great deep burst forth.
The rivers burst their banks, and the bridges wash away.
A tempest of hail, a destroying storm, a flood of mighty waters overflowing.
Flash floods rush down the wadis, carrying all before them.
The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their roaring waves.
The people wade through the swirling waters.
The stormy wind lifts up the waves of the sea.
They wade through the thigh-deep, waist-deep, surging flood.
I sink in deep mire where there is no foothold. I am come into deep waters where the floods overflow me.
The children cling to their parents. The parents cling to their children.
For the waves of death encompassed me. The torrents of destruction assailed me. The sorrows of hell compassed me about.
The people grip onto each other, slipping and sliding.
You sweep them away as with a flood. They are like a dream.
Thank you, Julian. Let us hope we don't become like a dream. As this is a session called Poems for the Planet, I thought I would finish with a poem from my new book, which celebrates what an astonishingly wonderful place this world is. Spring equinox. It creeps up on mossy shoes, but you're so tired of waking to dark and cold that you don't quite believe it'll ever come. Sure, the signs are false news sent to fool you into hope, even though they preen in their fancy that finery. Hey, look, we're primroses. Even when a wedding's worth full of petal confetti flutters to your feet and the swallows write spring in cursive calligraphy, reality's still the bite of frost, the slip of ice, the murk of mornings. Till the day you wake without alarm to sunshine lapping at your pillow, and your spirits lift to a sky so vast that larks are sucked into it, broadcasting height. And you rise like a bear from hibernation who pads to the cave mouth, heavy with sleep, and for 1 second forgets about hunger in the astonishment of light. Thank you. It's now going to be my huge pleasure to introduce Sarah Doyle. I've been an admirer, a huge admirer of Sarah's work for more than 10 years. And I have to tell you, it gets better every week. And I've been extremely fortunate too to have the benefit of her supportive and kind critical eye on my poems. Let me tell you a bit about her. She is poet in residence for the Pre-Raphaelite Society, and she judges their annual poetry competition. And her poetry is widely published in journals and placed in competitions. I had a long list, but it took too long to get through to read them all to you. Just to mention a few, she was runner-up in the Keats Shelley Poetry Prize. She won the Wolverhampton Literature Festival Poetry Competition and Holland Park Press's Brexit in Poetry in 2019. She was highly commended in the Ginkgo Prize for Eco-Poetry and in the Forward Prizes in 2018. She holds an MA in Creative Writing from Royal Holloway College, University of London, and is currently researching an absolutely fascinating PhD in meteorological poetry at Birmingham City University, and I can't wait to see the full collection that comes out from that. Her groundbreaking pamphlet of collage poems, inspired by Dorothy Wordsworth's journals, Something So New and Wild in This Feeling, which is absolutely marvelous and I can't recommend it too highly, was published by V Press in March 2021. So I'm going to hand you over now to the wonderful Sarah Doyle.
Oh, thank you so much for that lovely and generous introduction, Maggie. It's a great pleasure to read alongside friends, whether that's in the real world or virtually. I'm going to start with a poem by Charlotte Mew. It's called The Trees Are Down. Mew was an English poet who lived from 1869 to 1928. She wrote The Trees Are Down in the 1920s after seeing plane trees being sawn down in Euston Square Gardens, London. The poem was published in The Rambling Sailor, her posthumous poetry collection, in 1929. The Trees Are Down by Charlotte Mew. And he cried with a loud voice, hurt not the earth, neither the sea nor the trees. Revelation. They are cutting down the great plane trees at the end of the gardens. For days there has been the grate of the saw, the swish of the branches as they fall, the crash of the trunks, the rustle of trodden leaves, with the whoops and the wars, the loud common talk, the loud common laughs of the men above it all. I remember one evening of a long past spring, turning in at a gate, getting out of a cart, and finding a large dead rat in the mud of the drive. I remember thinking, alive or dead, a rat was a God-forsaken thing, but at least in May that even a rat should be alive. The week's work here is as good as done. There is just one bough on the roped bowl in the fine grey rain, green and high and lonely against the sky, down now. And but for that, if an old dead rat did once, for a moment, unmake the spring, I might never have thought of him again. It is not for a moment the spring is unmade today. These were great trees. It was in them from root to stem. When the men with the whoops and the wars have carted the whole of the whispering loveliness away, half the spring, for me, will have gone with them. It is going now, and my heart has been struck with the hearts of the plains. Half my life it has beat with these, in the sun, in the rains, in the March wind, the May breeze, in the great gales that came over to them across the roofs from the great seas. There was only a quiet rain when they were dying. They must have heard the sparrows flying and the small creeping creatures in the earth where they were lying. But I, all day, heard an angel crying, hurt not the trees. Well, in the spirit of Charlotte Mew's poem, my reading is going to be tree-themed and bird-themed. This is the poem that was highly commended in the Ginkgo Prize in 2018, and it is republished in our little blue pamphlet, Poems for the Planet. Night shifts in the nature factory. We make birds here, crows, ducks, owls, gulls, feathers glued to papier-mâché wings, legs fashioned with matchsticks. We carve seeds from plastic, beat metal until it turns to trees. We cast fossils. We tint skies with watercolour and stoke the smoke of clouds. We add salt to vats of sea and stir. We forge rats, foxes, cows, wolves, worms, winding the cogs of their mechanisms tightly for luck. We bake summers in a kiln and chill winters inside a walk-in fridge. We can synthesize night with the flick of a switch. Close your eyes, spread out your hands like stars. And look, we have hammered you a moon. Well, in praise of birds of prey, this is Owl. Transparent as the ghost of herself, she is the silent rush of air, knife-edged, camouflage mottled. She is chameleonic, the colour of tree bark, of old leaves, evening skies browning around her. She is serrated ailerons, microturbulence, swallowing sound as she digests the night. Noiseless as cloud, wings velvet muffled, all whispered velocity. She is a thresher of air, spinner of vortices. In the final thorn-sharp kiss, field mouse, you won't know a thing. Field mouse, you won't know a thing in the final thorn-sharp kiss. A thresher of air, spinner of vortices, muffled, all whispered velocity, she is noiseless as cloud wings, velvet swallowing sound as she digests the night. She is serrated ailerons, microturbulence, evening skies browning around her, the colour of tree bark, of old leaves, camouflage mottled. She is chameleonic. She is the silent rush of air, knife-edged, transparent as the ghost of herself. As Maggie said, I've recently published a pamphlet with V Press, which is a collection of poems that I've created from fragments of Dorothy Wordsworth's journals. And this is a wonderful tree encounter. And this poem is one entire passage that I've taken from the journals and have made a poem of on the page. Under Silver Howe. As we were going along, we were stopped at once, at the distance perhaps of 50 yards from our favourite birch tree. It was yielding to the gusty wind with all its tender twigs. The sun shone upon it, and it glanced in the wind like a flying sunshiny shower. It was a tree in shape, with stem and branches, but it was like a spirit of water. The sun went in, and it resumed its purplish appearance, the twig still yielding to the wind, but not so visibly to us. The other birch trees that were near it looked bright and cheerful, but it was a creature by its own self among them. This next poem is in celebration of birds, and I think it also speaks to their fragility as well. And it's comprised of lots of fragments that I've taken from the journals and stitched together to make a poem. Lights and shadows. We stood some minutes watching the swallows that flew about restlessly and flung their shadows upon the sunbright walls of the old building. The shadows glanced and twinkled, interchanged and crossed each other, expanded and shrunk up, appeared and disappeared every instant, seeming more like living things than the birds themselves. The sun shone so brightly, with such a fierce light, that there was even something like the purity of one of nature's own grand spectacles. Rocks glittered in the sunshine, distant hills were visible, the evening sun was now sending a glorious light. Islanded with sunshine, bathed in golden light, my heart danced while the sun was yet shining. And this is me. This is in celebration of urban nature. I think we tend to think that all the good stuff happens in the green spaces in the countryside, but I live in a city, and there's lots to celebrate and lots that needs protecting here as well. City gull has no taste for fish unless it's battered, fried, vinegar drenched, and spilling half-eaten from an overfull dustbin. He's never caught a herring in his life. He settles on street lamps as if they were, for all the world, crow's nests, and has no notion of the winds that brought his ancestors here generations ago. City gull was born to the smoke, an urban hatchling, streetwise and ready-mapped, no need to be taught the wheres and hows of the complex crisscross that spreads beneath him. He is all Cockney birthright, rough and ready squawks, wrought from a hawker's gullet. He is king of the tip, lord of landfill, dines royally on detritus and dumps where he pleases, wasting no thought on the paintwork of cars. City gull wonders sometimes at his webbed feet, the splashy clatter on allotment shed roofs during his clumsy halts. He does not understand why, when his A to Z synapses know only this city, he wakes from strange dreams where the air tastes of salt. And to finish, this was published in, I think it was the second issue of a marvellous journal called Finnish Creatures, which has got a really really positive, but also I think a really important ecological agenda. And this is a song of asking. We asked the bird why it would not nest, why it would not nest. The bird told us to ask the branch, and so we asked the branch. We asked the branch why it would not bud, why it would not bud. The branch told us to ask the root, and so we asked the root. We asked the root why it would not drink, why it would not drink. The root told us to ask the rain, and so we asked the rain. We asked the rain why it would not quench, why it would not quench. The rain told us to ask the earth, and so we asked the earth. We asked the earth why the bird won't nest, why the branch won't bud. The earth told us to ask ourselves, so we asked the earth again. We asked the earth why the roots won't drink, why the rain won't quench. The earth told us to ask ourselves, but we only asked the birds. And that's it from me, but this does mean that I now get the opportunity to introduce Julian Bishop, who's reading after me. Julian Bishop has had a lifelong interest in ecology and worked for a long time as environment reporter for BBC Wales. He's now a member of the collective group Poets for the Planet. A former runner-up in the Ginkgo Prize for Eco-Poetry, he's been shortlisted for the Bridport Poetry Prize and was longlisted in this year's National Poetry Competition. Julian has recently had poems published in The Morning Star, Extinction Rebellion's Rebel Talk, Riptide Journal, Finnish Creatures magazine, and the first 2 issues of The Alchemy Spoon. In April of this year, Julian won the first prize in the Poets and Players Poetry Competition for his stunning poem, Sitting for Caravaggio. You can visit Julian's website at julianbishop.com or find him on Twitter, where he tweets as Julian B. Poet. I want to add that Julian is not only a very talented poet with impeccable eco-credentials, he's also a lovely friend to have. He even sent me flower seeds in the post during lockdown to lift my spirits, for which I was very grateful. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Julian.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a very generous introduction. I'd like to pick up on your theme of birds a little later in my reading, but I'm going to start with a poem about the crisis in our seas. And this is the poem that was runner-up in the Ginkgo Prize 2-3 years ago. It's called Lobster. Pepsi. It was the brand he grew up with. the sweet memory of it, the familiar tang of aluminium. Each night cradled in a cot of cans, suckled on bottles, sleeping on a seabed littered with plastic toys, top spinning on the floor, every one of them Pepsi. He dressed up in armor. It became a habit with a Pepsi logo, hung out with a pile of drifters, washed up types who didn't even look fine on the surface. They all drank Pepsi. He got a tattoo, festooned in red and blue. He soon became a brand ambassador, the extravagant fandangle spangled on a hand. But he threw it all away, bottled it. Abandoned, he washed up on a beach. That's where I found him, junked and only a Pepsi filigree. Even his mum had sent him packing. It's not just the rubbish on our oceans that I'd like to concentrate on today. It's also the rubbish under our streets as well. And my next poem is about a exhibit at the Museum of London a couple of years back, which was a little slab of a fatberg, which is the horrible kind of mess that gets flushed down the drains and our sinks. Fatberg. It might have escaped from a laboratory, a biological curiosity with the body of an octopus, but no limbs, a pudgy, limpid belly, jellified cheeks and bulging condom eyes with a double-decker wrapper for a tongue. The flushers discovered its mother snoozing in Whitechapel's bowels, swaddled in a blanket of fat, a recumbent stalagmite of discarded wet wipes, bringing London's movements to a halt. Now a gang of riveted children gasp at a quivering sliver of it, caged behind strengthened glass, as it spawns an army of small flies, and wonder at the perversity of a monstrous sculpture carved out of our own bodies, a disgusting portrayal in oils of a terrible time of waste. We're each going to concentrate on a poem from the past and a poet from the past that means something to us, that perhaps could be called an eco-poet. And I think John Clare is probably, to my mind, the first eco-poet. He was deeply disturbed by the Enclosure Act 2 or 3 centuries back, which basically got rid of a lot of common land. And Clare himself was very affected. He used to wander through the countryside, writing his poems, and a lot of his favorite pathways were denied to him. More about that in a moment, but I'd just like to read you one of his incredible poems that show that close attention to nature that I think is a common feature of a lot of eco poems now. It's called A Nightingale's Song. Chee-choo, 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 cheer, 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 choo, 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 cheer up, tweet, 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 jug, 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 woo, 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 chur, chur, woo-it, to-it, tweet, 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 jug, 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 tiroo, 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 go, go, choo-it, chur, 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 will, tweetum, jug, 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 grig, 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 choo, choo, weavy wit, weavy wit, weavy wit, chee-chit, 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 wee wit, wee wit, wee wit, chee-chee-chee, piloo, 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 bring a jug, bring a jug, bring a jug. And in case you don't know what a nightingale sounds like, a little flavour there for you of a real nightingale. Clare is incredible, and he meant the world to me. In fact, when I was much younger, and I grew up in a very isolated village in Wiltshire. John Clare really spoke to me because he spoke about all the things that I would come across every day. Sadly for Clare, the Enclosure Act and the closing of the footpaths didn't do much for his mental state, and it's thought of being one of the factors that actually had him committed to a lunatic asylum. Clare, being Clare, wasn't standing for that. He escaped. And he walked hundreds of miles from that asylum back to his home. He wrote about that journey in a marvelous prose book. And I've written my own tribute to John Clare that commemorates that incredible adventure. It's called The Flitting, which is how John Clare described it. And it uses some of the dialect words, the Northamptonshire dialect that was very close to John Clare's heart. I love John Clare for the bumberells, for oddling crows, puddocks and the ling, for Hazley Woods where the maidens went a-nutting, the chittering crickets that chelp, for dells where mouldywarps swee to the wind, for little trotty wagtail tittering in a watery pudge, for the craking, wimpling blebs of a brook. Tottering of mind, he shambled 80 miles to Helpston, poddled down rut gold lanes, driven by a vision of home. Rotten as the stubborn of a drooping dotterel, he laid himself down among cowslip pips and sliving flies, ecstatic as a petty chap in the vaulted skies. Bumberells, in case you're wondering what they are among all the others, are long-tailed tits. There's a lot of birds in that poem, which echoes Sarah's marvelous readings. I'd like to bring us up to date with a few poems from lockdown where I certainly got a lot closer to nature. And like Sarah as well, my nature is an urban one. This first poem is a sonnet that was written in the early days of lockdown. It's called Rush Hour. 1 month in, and a wild rush hour quickened along the verges, nature slamming down hard on the accelerator. Rigs of cow parsley towered above curbs in Galley Lane, exploding into stars. Rivers of bluebells lapped against tarmac on a surge of sap fueled by a million lost springs. Dandelions had no time to turn clocks into ashes when the lockdown stopped. Air charged with birdsong soured in the roar of a more familiar rush hour, when strimmers returned to crew-cut the verges, all our new rivers dried up. Sadly, that's happening again. I walked down that very same Galley Lane just a couple of days ago, and the strimmers have been out, and sadly all those flowers have been destroyed. One of the things I spotted on the verges, which is a sign of hope, if you like, was a grass snake. And I felt it deserved a little poem all to itself as well. Grass snake. My kingdom has shrunk to a junction, a fume-hazed haven on the verges, home turf bathed in puddle spray, diesel-thickened air. I slither between toad ditch and road gutter, thread through horsetail, restless fescue, hunker beneath signs warning one-way road. Dwarfed by towers of burnt-out hemlock, I lie low between leaky roofs of ferns, invisible among the twisted lives of ivies bittersweet. I glance against Coke cans, wriggle over humps of spent laughing gas canisters, discarded masks, my horizons curbed by a black sea of tarmac. I'm a refugee, caught between damp crosshairs of fallen nettles, a hard rain of hogweed seeds. I'm a green wave breaking, a gleam in the grass. My final poem of the lockdown sequence is about a caterpillar, and it speaks for itself. The weeks play out in peaks and troughs, charted by the parabola of his back. He meanders from one room to another, all wreathed in the same leafy wallpaper. Every morsel of groundsel is a groundhog day. There's no furlough for a hungry caterpillar. He knows an airborne killer hovers over his world of constant foraging, a beak swooping out from behind the green curtain. Nonchalant about the hair-raising danger, other caterpillars give him sage advice. Bruv, it'll get you one way or another. One day his restricted life will be lifted by the gods gifting him a pair of wings. From the cockpit of his modified body, he will gaze down goggle-eyed on a land reconfigured, where for a few precious weeks, heaven was a place of herbal teas, perpetual eating, garden meals, the boundaries of liberation. Where will his newfound freedom take him? For my final poem, I'd like to sound a little note of hope, which is wildly fanciful. It's called Ash. My heart has darkening rings about it. Age has carved its name on my bark. Limbs creak, I sway on a stick. It's hard to see stars in the dark. But the years fail to stem my ambition of one day taming the sun. I imagine a tangle of branches extending a cage around Earth, like fish in a coral cave. Forests would follow in a mass revolution of leaves, a green solution to pollution, with the whole world warming to my plan, to encase the globe in a protective blanket. A desperate last gasp to save the planet. I think we should grasp it while we can. Thank you very much. I'd now like to introduce to you my colleague Cheryl Moskowitz. I've known Cheryl for many years. And how do I describe her? Well, she's got a background in psychology and theatre, and she's worked variously as an actor, a storyteller, tutor, counsellor, university lecturer, and of course, poet. Primarily, she works as a writing facilitator in deprived areas of the community, in schools, prisons, care homes, with the homeless and with refugees. And poetry is definitely central to all she does. She writes for children as well as adults. Her poems have won several awards, including in the National Poetry Competition and the International Moth Poetry Prize. She's author of the novel Wyoming Trail, published by Granta, the poetry collection, The Girl is Smiling, and the children's poetry book, Can It Be About Me? During the pandemic, she produced the Corona collection, poems written in response to conversations with children affected by school closures. Her poetry pamphlet, Maternal Impression, came out just over a month ago. And it's with Against the Grain Poetry Press. It's been shortlisted for the best poetry pamphlet in this year's Saboteur Awards. It's a fantastic book, and I can't recommend it enough. Together with poets Yvonne Reddick and Maya Chowdhury, Cheryl is co-editing Magma 81. It's an issue that's devoted entirely to writing about the Anthropocene. Cheryl says, there really is no other subject. Who we are, how we affect one another, and the marks we leave behind on the planet that we share is everything. And I would totally second that. I give to you, Cheryl Moskowitz.
Cheryl, you've got you're still muted, Cheryl.
Sorry, I will say my whole spiel again. I want to thank you so much, Julian, for that introduction, and to thank all of you, Sarah, Maggie, and Julian, for your beautiful, beautiful poems, which have been so inspiring, invigorating, and a real sort of call to arms. So it's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm going to share my screen with you now. And read to you from, first of all, the poem that I've chosen to read by someone else is the wonderful Rita Dove, American poet, essayist, and at the time in 1993, when she was appointed the Poet Laureate of the US, she was the youngest ever and the first ever African-American woman to hold that role. This is a beautiful poem, I think, where we get taken close to deep time, and the edges, if there are any, between poetry and science get blurred from the perspective of a fossil. The fish in the stone. The fish in the stone would like to fall back into the sea. He is weary of analysis, the small, predictable truths. He is weary of waiting in the open, his profile stamped by a white light. In the ocean, The silence moves and moves, and so much is unnecessary. Patient, he drifts until the moment comes to cast his skeletal blossom. The fish in the stone knows to fail is to do the living a favor. He knows why the ant engineers a gangster's funeral, garish and perfectly amber. He knows why the scientist in secret delight strokes the fern's voluptuous braille. This poem was commissioned by Helen Yeomans, who runs the One World Choir, and the One World Choir were doing a London show, and spoken word was woven into the choir's voices, and I was really honoured to be asked to write a piece. And really sort of just a matter of months before, I had experienced the wonderful Oliver Eliasson's exhibition outside the Tate Modern, where he'd brought icebergs and we could actually experience their melting, and that found its way into this poem. It starts with an epigraph from Mary Oliver, and the first 3 lines were taken directly from a talk I heard Michelle Obama do at the South Bank. Why should we care? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Love doesn't form you. Experience does. You know how smart you are. But sometimes your memory fails you, like that time you said never again, and still you did. Remember how afraid you were? We all are in the beginning. We want the freedom to go out and enjoy the space, and when it's dark, to come back inside. Life is a template that keeps renewing itself, but we are good at forgetting. That wheel that served us so well in the first place, we moved mountains, didn't we? Reinvented, never turns out to be quite so perfectly round. I want to tell you a story about geese, the way they fly, arrow-shaped, and how they get to where they are going. There is always the one out front, but to lead is tiring, and to only ever follow one head is unsustainable. So positions change, they have to. Each goose lifts the air with her wings to make the path a little more manageable, navigable for the one behind, and so on. And when one goose falls, 2 others will fall deliberately to be with him. It's not a friend or even a kindness thing. It's survival. We stay alive by looking after one another. Let me tell you another story about a child pulled from the wreckage after a bomb or an earthquake, a fire or a flood decimates the building and the bed she was asleep in. Together with her baby brother, her mother and father in the room next door, her cousins and her grandmother sleeping in the room next to that one. The rescue worker who finds her carries her blinking into the daylight, where there are light bulbs and thermoses of hot drink, cameras and people cheering. Now we need to find you a home, one of the people says, pointing to the rubble. I have a home, says the girl, pointing to her heart. I just need a house to put it in. Before now, I had never been up close to an iceberg or considered it anything other than metaphor, some cold, sinister presence just under the surface that might, if we're not careful, break open the hull of the safe ship we are sailing in and sink us all into oblivion. But now I can see that it is the ice in peril and we are the danger, standing helplessly by while vast parts of our world carve into the sea, disappearing the fish, the fox, the ox, and the caribou, floating them away on islands of false hope. the polar bear escaping hunger and guns and the gush of meltwater flooding its homeland, sinking us all into oblivion. Some months ago, I pressed my face next to a block of ice, lost from Greenland's ice sheet, fished from the Nuuk Kangerlua fjord and brought to rest at London's bankside. I held myself there a while, against its dying coldness, looked into its impossibly blue interior, listened to the drip and crackle of its ever diminishing tongues, and ran my tongue across its surface to try to taste its ocean past, which I discovered later, at home in bed with the one I love, tastes the same as the salt we make with our bodies when we sweat or bleed or cry. This next poem is in my new pamphlet, Maternal Impression. It's a lament, I suppose, to acts of cruelty, not just that we commit to our planet, but the creatures that live in it. Asian elephants, like their African counterparts, have become part of the growing list of endangered species. And their population has diminished by half in the last 75 years, and that percentage is going to rise and rise. Typically, a baby elephant will be captured in the wild and the mother killed in the process. This poem references Ganesh as a female in Hindu religion. It's a male deity, the god of beginnings and worshipped for his intellect and wisdom. This is Mother Ganesh under the arches. Do you hear the rattle of the trains over your elephant head? Look how she cries, real tears from her elephant eyes. Under the bridge, Pajan, Pajan. A cracked black eye under the arches, we make her, break her, beat her with bull hooks, thrash her with chains. See how she cries in elephant pain. And I should have said that that word Pajan actually means breaking the spirit, and it is the method by which elephants are made to be submissive to the humans that catch them. And I'm going to finish with this poem, which I wrote some years ago when on a residency in a beautiful, beautiful place, the Ragdale Foundation in Lakeville, I can't remember, just outside Chicago, wonderful prairie. And I encountered a doe, and this will be my poem to finish on. And I just want to thank the Stay at Home Festival for having us. It's been a really wonderful opportunity. And as Sarah said, always wonderful to read with friends, but very, very special today. So thank you. On seeing a doe in the prairie by the bridge. Out there in the cold, you don't expect to see anyone. Glad if you don't, actually. Time to be alone, find a stump, brush the mound of snow off, sit for a while by the creek that's all froze up and listen like the deer do. You are a stranger here. The birds know that, calling out to one another in their strange tongue, retreat, retreat, retreat. And all at once she's there. Chestnut markings like a dark target framed against the vast white, and so are you. Afraid to reach for your phone in case she thinks it's a gun and runs, in case this moment doesn't last. At last, she looks, sees you looking, answers your looking with a stare, and you hook eyes like antlers, both gripped by what you don't know about the other. and for that long held moment. You are both graceful, forgiven. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Stay at Home Festival. Thank you to my fellow poets, and thanks for coming.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to finish